One of the things that's not good about most journalism covering disability issues is that it tends to treat disabled people as not part of the audience, but as an object that the audience is looking at. And while I know that readers of Forbes are probably mostly not disabled, I want to write for non-disabled people and for disabled people.
Welcome to the See-Through Podcast, a podcast that creates transparency on life with a disability through raw conversations with the disability community. I'm your host, Lance Johnson, and I live and podcast with the eye disease, retinitis pigmentosa, or RP for short. In this episode, I talk with the great Andrew Pulrang, who is a contributing writer for Forbes magazine. Andrew and I go deep on some topics I've been wanting to cover, like how the disability community perceives itself, where Andrew and I both fit within the community itself, and how the Democratic and Republican parties approach disabled rights. But before this epic interview begins, make sure you subscribe to the podcast, follow on social media. The handle is @SeeThroughPod. And if you want bonus episodes and exclusive content, go join the See-Through Few over on Patreon. The link is in the show description. Andrew Pulrang, welcome to the See-Through Podcast.
Thanks, Lance. It's good to meet you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I've been excited about interviewing you. You're here in New York?
Yes, I live in upstate New York in Plattsburgh.
Plattsburgh, okay, awesome. And I brought you on because I stumbled upon your writing. You know, I have a podcast about disabilities, and I felt like when I started this podcast, and we'll talk about this, I knew absolutely nothing. You know, and I still don't know much, to be honest with you, which is why I talk to people who do know stuff. So, yeah. And when I stumbled upon your articles on for Forbes, I was like, oh, I really like the way that this guy writes. And I like what not only do I like his writing style, but I like what he's saying, and I like his personality and how he's getting across this really dense, almost, I wouldn't call it philosophical, but it is from like a sociological standpoint. It's very dense, I feel like. And to speak for a whole community, like, you know, speak for the entire disability community, I'm sure you're not going to win everyone over, you know, in terms of, but you have to, that'd be a hard objective to do. So what I noticed when reading your articles that kind of talk about various things about the disability community is you took a bold approach because you have your own personal fingerprints on them, but at the same time, they really did feel like they captured what I was thinking too. And I bet you a lot of other people reading your articles feel the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. You know, one of the challenges of it is trying to figure out point of view each time I write something. How much should I be writing about it from my own point of view, explicitly saying I, you know, as myself. I tend to sort of go halfway between that and a more sort of objective, taking myself out of the story thing, to where I try to articulate what's happening among people with disabilities. So I write more along the lines of we. The other difficulty there is, you know, one of the things that's not good about most journalism covering disability issues is that it tends to treat disabled people as not part of the audience, but as an object that the audience is looking at. And while I know that readers of Forbes are probably mostly not disabled, I want to write for both for them, for non-disabled people, and for disabled people. But I think that's a challenge that everybody faces when they're writing about disability is, you know, who are we talking to? And can you talk to both audiences effectively? So we keep trying.
Yeah, and I, I have this podcast, and my connection to the disability community is I have a retinal eye disease called retinitis pigmentosa, and it's degenerative, so I'm slowly losing my vision. Most cases leads to legal blindness.
Right.
My mom is legally blind. My sister also has RP as well. So from my perspective, growing up, I wasn't really affected by my vision until recently, and I've been noticing declines in my vision, and I've kind of had to come to terms with, all right, I'm probably going to be legally blind. And I'm a video editor,
Yeah.
so the two kind of are tied in together. So I've always had this big pent up amount of anxiety about facing my disability. And that's kind of what I find interesting and why I wanted to start this podcast and why I like your writing, because it talks to both audiences. I feel like I have one foot, I'm in the disabled world, and then I have 1 foot, in the non-disabled world. And sometimes there's a push and pull between my mentalities and how I think about myself in my head. And I think that's why I enjoy talking to other people in the community, because if you like growing up, the only person I really had in my circle with, let's just narrow it down strictly to vision, was my mom. So she was my only person in my personal life with a disability, which,
Right.
So I figured who else to better to learn from than people in the community. And I'm trying to, and the more and more I talk to people within the community, the more and more I feel a part of it, and the more I want to understand it better. So that's my background and where I'm coming from and I think that's why I appreciate your writing, because I feel like it talked to both sides of where my brain is in terms of accepting and wanting to know more.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think it's really what you're saying is, in your experiences, is very significant and very somewhat common in the disability community, that a huge portion of us are either not part of what you would call the disability community in a conscious sense, or have really ambivalence about who we want to be. Do we want to be a quote unquote normal person who just happens to have a disability, which is a common type of formulation that some people really adopt for a variety of reasons? They want to be seen not as, distinct, but as just like everyone else. I just happen to have a disability. Or then you have people who are, for various reasons, are very much, having a disability is a huge part of my life, my identity, my experience. And some people are there by default because their type of disability makes it almost impossible to be anything else. You can't act really credibly like you're not disabled, or you just have to. You need a lot of support services. Your disabilities are extremely apparent. They interrupt your daily life at all turns. But then there's other people who could potentially kind of blend in a little bit more, but choose for various reasons over time to say, but I identify anyway because I still have these disabilities. They still create issues. They still run me up against barriers in society that I can't just wish away, that I have to deal with one way or another. And then, of course, the issue comes up, how do people deal with their disabilities? Do they deal with it as a personal challenge, sort of a self-improvement, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, rehabilitation, make the best of myself, motivational kind of approach? Or to what extent do you do that? And to what extent do you do, I need to band together with others who have disabilities to change policies, to change society, to make it a better place for disabled people to live? These are fundamental divisions in the community. And again, one of the divisions that contributes to that is that not all of us are born with our disabilities. In fact, probably most of us aren't. Probably the majority of people who are disabled in some way, had it come later in life through illness or disease or just age. And that's a very, very different experience. And tons of our number are people who didn't used to be disabled, and come at it virtually the same as any other person attending a disability awareness seminar. The only difference being that they are actually either facing or are already dealing with a somewhat new disability. So, I think it's different for, you're not in quite the same boat as someone attending a seminar at work, 101 level disability awareness, because you're dealing with it in a very direct way. But then again, you're not quite in the same boat as somebody who's may have been blind from birth, or somebody with cerebral palsy from birth, or another kind of disability entirely. So yeah, it's all, and that's why, one of the first things you were saying about speaking for the disability community, there's no way that I can do that because the disability, or that anyone else could, because the disability community is enormously broad and very diverse, extremely hard to pull together in terms of shared experiences and challenges. Although I do believe in the end that there is more that we share, and that there is something that binds us together.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think there is something that binds people together, especially the disability community. And what I was surprised by, and I've talked about this before, is whenever I started to dive deep into finding people who also have RP, the eye disease I have, it seemed like, there's Facebook groups, the RP support Facebook group, if I meet people and network on social media, it's so easy for me to find people with RP, and I could, if I wanted to, just stick to that community, and that could be my community. But then what I also the way I started thinking about things, I was like, the whole community as a whole has different things going on, but accessibility issues and society's perceptions of them, there's a lot of commonalities. No matter what your disability is, you still have to mentally adapt to it. There's different physical adaptations, but I started to become very interested in the mental side of that. And that's one thing that I feel like no matter who I talk to, I learn something new is, because everyone has a different story. Everyone has a different disability. Some people were diagnosed young. Some people, had an accident that made them disabled. And then, so everybody's story creates this kind of very unique mental journey of it. And most of the time what I've noticed, it starts with not accepting, and then there's like this character arc of, now I'm, I feel empowered and I want to, talk about things, and I'm slowly getting there. And the more and more I do this podcast, the more and more I feel a weight off my back in terms of constantly being worried about is what's my future going to be like as someone who's legally blind. So I appreciate what you're doing in terms of talking to not only non-disabled people and disabled people, but even the fact that you like to address, and I've read it in some of your articles, how even there's subcategories even within the disability community, and there's different ways to interact with the community. I'd like to hear more about that.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, I think, one thing that comes to mind from what you just said, I think one of the divides is between people who have been through more steps in that process than others. And, I myself, I've lived with disabilities my whole life. I'm 54 years old. So I've had 54 years to go through every process and all that. And I'm still doing it. I'm not saying I've got it all figured out, but, and coming down mostly on the side of, disability is part of my identity. It's not the entire thing, but it's certainly part of it. That's my general position is I do not go around carefully telling people not that I'm not defined by my disability. I don't call myself differently abled. I'm not trying to figure out ways to blend in a super conscious way. And I also have an activist approach. When I deal with disability, I'm less interested in my own day-to-day functioning as a topic. I mean, I have to deal with it, but it's not interesting to me, like the fluctuations of my breathing and my pain levels and whatnot. I'm more interested in what's going on in the community and barriers. So that's a place to be. But, we have to constantly remember that that's not where everybody is. And tons of people are just starting to deal with disability. Tons of people have been dealing with it for a while, but are very much in the self-focused. Some people have to be because their disabilities are not stable. They are much more medically intense than some others of us would like to admit. The whole medical model, social model thing is a very useful concept, but it can be oversimplifying where, if you're a paraplegic, day to day, week to week, year to year, your condition may not change that much. As long as you have a decent wheelchair and certain things are in place, you could kind of adapt and things stay the same. But that's a very, very different situation than, say, chronic pain or deteriorating disability or that is progressive. And folks in that position don't have as much ability to just blow off the personal medical aspects and only focus on the social and cultural aspects of disability. So many things. And then finally, I think it has to be brought up and still isn't brought up enough is to use a overused term, privilege. If you take two people who have almost identical disabilities, but one of them has a good income, has wealth, has the ability to accumulate wealth, financial stability, education, family that is genuinely supportive, and other racial advantages, gender advantages, sexuality advantages. That's a very different situation than somebody who has almost no income, no ability to save, and therefore financial instability, who maybe their family isn't supportive in the sort of classic way that we tend to expect. Maybe live in environments where they are stigmatized and bullied every day, instead of regarded as like inspirational or people to be supported. There's tons of ways that people with the same disabilities can have multiple strikes against them that I don't think that we acknowledge enough and work on enough. So again, that's another way that we are divided.
Yeah, there's so many ways we're divided, and I think you're 100% right. Your background, financial situation. There's so many things that factor in, and I think self-awareness around it is a big deal in terms of speaking out and talking about it. Sometimes I feel, sometimes I even ask myself, I'm like, am I qualified to talk about about the disability community? Because I feel like I said earlier, I feel like I have, one foot in one door and one foot in the other. And I have a great amount of privilege. My parents are supportive. I have education, I have income and all that. And so you're 100% right. And I think self-awareness is a big deal. And, but I do battle that. I do battle that sometimes where I'm like, am I stepping on people's toes by trying, I don't want people to perceive that they think that, I think I'm speaking for them or I'm speaking for everyone with RP. Whereas I try to be very open. I'm talking about someone who's newly diagnosed essentially with a degenerative eye disease who is likely going to go legally blind and already suffers some diminished field of vision. And that's such a specific thing. And but I do worry sometimes how I'm interpreted by, let's say someone who was born with cerebral palsy and they listen to my podcast. They may be like, who is this guy, to talk about this? And I don't blame them for saying that, but I'm just exploring my curiosity, and I'm trying to teach myself and learn. And I just happen to make it public, and I happen to make it a podcast,
Well, and that's all any of us can do. And it seems like what you're doing is you're just presenting questions, and you're giving an audience to other people to present a variety of different perspectives. And I think, yes, we need to be aware of privilege, whichever way it goes for us. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we have to silence ourselves. It doesn't mean that we have to become obsessed with it to the point where we don't feel like we can say or do anything. I think just being aware of it, remembering it, not forgetting it. There are people that I've seen, in social disability, social media, people with followings and things like that who do, if you watch them for a while, they do have some privilege. It seeps in for a while, say, maybe one of the reasons why these people are living such sort of amazing lives with their disabilities. Maybe part of that is because however it is, they have income, they have, wealth, they have supportive people around them. But if they make the point to say that, to note that, to be, in your term, transparent about that, and to bring up the fact on a semi-regular basis that, what you're seeing here is partly because of certain supports that we have that others don't have, and let's work on that. I mean, I think that's another opportunity. We don't have to all agree. We don't have to all have the same experiences, but acknowledging each other's difficulties is super important. I come from a background of working in disability services at Centers for Independent Living. And even there, it can be challenging on a day-to-day basis to, if you come as a disabled person who has had a relatively supportive environment, it's kind of a rude shock to see how bad ableism really can be, and how bad poverty can be, and how difficult the barriers can really be. You can get this sense, if you're not careful, of, disability is difficult and prejudice is there, but it's not the same as other minorities. It's not the same as other types of oppression. It's a little less bad because it's mostly misunderstanding and all that. If you really spend enough time in the field, you start to realize, sometimes it's not bad, but sometimes it's really bad. And I think that's and acknowledging that is part of the whole journey. And realizing that some of us in the community who perhaps are angrier, who are more like short-fused or, more militant, have reason to be. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I mean, that's certainly a way that I've grown, because my general nature is not to be super militant, not to be super angry all the time. And I used to be less tolerant of that and less understanding. And I'm trying to gain the realization that, people have reason to be angry, and there's a space for that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree that people have a right to be angry. And that's something I want to talk to you about, is activism, because, it's year 2022, social justice is a big thing. And I was curious on, how do you think the disability community factors into that?
Yeah.
Is it overlooked? Is it overshadowed by other maybe, issues going on? Do you think that, or
yes.
How do you think it plays into current modern day society?
Well, I hesitate to speak too deeply about it because, again, my own position of privilege on a number of different fronts means that I'm somewhat of an outside observer. However, I do think, yes, that in terms of the broadly defined social justice movement or ethos or whatever, disability is still sort of a junior partner. Is often overlooked. People in the social justice space are often ableist. People who are on the left of politics, Democrats, what have you, sometimes will use ableist rhetoric. They will espouse policies that are not good, I think, and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's a difficult thing. At the same time, the disability community itself is not probably where it should be on issues of race and gender and sexuality. And that's definitely a dialogue that's going on in disability activism and disability culture, coming to terms with the fact that, just because you have a disability and have kind of been involved in some disability advocacy doesn't necessarily mean that you understand racial politics or gender politics or sexuality politics. And people are still racist and people are still homophobic and sexist that are within the disability community. So there's work to do on both ends of that, in effect. I mean, I think it's getting better. I mean, even 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago, compared to that, I think it's getting a little better. If nothing else, the fact that we're discussing them at all is an improvement. When I started in the independent living and disability rights back in the early 90s, it was virtually not a topic, and there was a definite school of thought that what disability activism needed to do was to be its own thing and not really get involved in other movements because we had to stand on our own. And I think that has mostly changed. And, I think mostly the movement has decided that it needs to be integrated with other social movements. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, because there's, and that's something that is interesting to me is how, there's, like you mentioned, there's sexism, people who are homophobic, racist, but then, the disability community is so big and covers such a wide variety of people that basically everyone is a part of it. And then you have all these different types of disabilities and then different situations for each person with the same disability, like we talked about. So everyone has these very unique perspectives, but they're all part of this one minority. And I feel like it's hard to be on the same page. And I feel like your writing touches on that a lot. And there's one thing that you mentioned is that, and something I notice as a 31-year-old, I'm not a young TikToker, but I am like on Instagram, and I did grow up with MySpace and Facebook, and now and I'm on Instagram. So I've seen the space change and grow for social media. I'm like in that middle ground, I had a flip phone in high school, so like I'm not super young and hip as I think I am. You know what I mean? And when I'm on these social spaces, and I do notice a difference, and you to discuss this, there are generational differences in the community, and I would be curious to know your thoughts. What do you think the generational differences are, and how do those play into the age of social justice and what's going on now?
Well, I get the one that comes to mind. The big difference that comes to mind for me most often is the level of expectations. I think one of the things I wrote recently, a while ago, was about how in the early 90s when I started, and that even then, that's later in the disability rights movement in a way. But there used to be sort of a unspoken deal that even the activist community would agree, generally agreed, that there were limits to what we could expect from society. Now, we wanted all that we felt that we could expect from society, and some, probably embodied most in the Americans with Disabilities Act was kind of like, whether intended or not, it ended up being kind of like a framework that said, here is what we expect in terms of rights and access. And we expect to be fulfilled, which at the time was more than most people had. Now, though, it seems like more of a minimal base than it did at the time. And that's natural. That shouldn't be outrageous or surprising. And I think one of the things about the generations is the newer generations take some level of basic accommodation for granted. And I don't think that's a bad thing. That it can be portrayed as a bad thing, as being entitled or whatever. I think it's good because you have to keep moving forward. We made compromises back in the day to get some progress, but those compromises should not be forever. An example, I think we took it for granted and really tried to teach people that, answering questions about our accommodation needs with, school administrators and employers and stuff like that, we had to be prepared to do that. We had to be really prepared to be open and speak about what our needs were, because how else could we get them met? But I think one thing I see a lot in social media now is people, say college students with disabilities or people who are employed with disabilities, saying, why do I have to jump through all these hoops to get accommodations? Why do I have to answer questions a million times and fill out tons of paperwork to get accommodations? It's humiliating and it's burdensome. And so it's caused people my age, and I think my generation, to really look at that and say, hopefully, question ourselves and say, yeah, maybe it's time to revisit some of those barriers that we used to sort of agree to, but maybe we shouldn't anymore. And certainly, I think there's a general belief among almost all generations that the accessibility issue has not been as great as we thought it was going to be when the ADA passed. But again, the other thing I would say, the generational difference is, and we kind of alluded to this earlier, is that an earlier generation of disability rights, I think, made it a very high priority to say that disabled people are not sick, right? We wanted to move away from being medical patients and into being citizens with social priorities and social rights and legal rights. So it was important to portray ourselves, and also we wanted to be employed, we wanted to have opportunities. So, we kind of took the tack that we're fine, we have disabilities, but we're fine. You can count on us. We're capable of doing stuff. Don't worry, we can handle it. Just give us the chance. And we're not sick. But I think that oversimplified the experience of disability, because some disabilities do involve a type of illness and a type of situation that's not always stable, that we can't always control, that make us not always super capable of doing everything that we want to do every time. And it cut out people who really should be part of the disability community. People with chronic illnesses like diabetes and lung conditions, and people with chronic pain and chronic illnesses, who I think are now becoming more allied with and part of the disability community, because I think more of us see the social and medical differences as being more of a continuum, where it's some of it is medical, and some of us have to deal with individual limitations that no legislation is ever going to change. But at the same time, it doesn't make sense either to just focus on our own physical conditions or mental conditions. We have to deal with social barriers as well. Does that make sense? I mean, I think it's everything's more subtle now and a little bit more less simplistic with the newer generation than it was maybe in previous years.
Yeah, so and that's something I'm interested in is the medical model, the social model, and you've written about that, and basically I want to break it down just to see if I'm right. Yeah. And so in the past, you know, the society's perception of the disabled was more emphasis on curing the disability. Focusing on it medically, that's how you solve the problem. Okay. And then the switch to social, the social model is more of, it's not our disability, it's the structure of society and social oppression. Yep. Versus, and once that kind of switch from trying to be cured to making things more accommodating for the community, that's when the change of mentality kind of happened, where you did, if you were disabled, you didn't want to talk a lot about your disability or the hardships that may come with it, because you wanted to kind of hype yourself up and along with the community up to build the community up. Yeah. And keep that progress going. But now, would you say what you're saying is now there's kind of this healthy mix of, yes, you know, I don't need to be cured and things need to be more accommodating and accessible, but at the same time, I do have challenges and I should be able to talk about my challenges openly without being viewed as I guess viewed as annoying or weak.
Exactly.
Or, you know, is that what it is?
Or letting the side down in a way. Yeah. I think so. I think there is more subtlety now. I mean, I feel like the social model, medical model idea was at its best, is a useful way of, especially with newcomers in a way, or people who haven't really thought about disability much, is a useful way to pry some things apart that need to be pried apart and understood as distinct things, like the difference between your personal, direct, tactile experience of your disability and the social aspects of your disability. Like, those are very different things. And once you start to see the difference, it can really crack open your head in a way. And it's really liberating and can be very liberating and useful. I've met tons of people for whom it was personally liberating because they could separate the two and pursue them in different ways. Where it goes wrong is when it's used as kind of a doctrine, as like, you have to be one or the other, right? And it's a set of rules. So I think that's how it gets misused. I mean, any concept like that, any philosophical concept, is going to be misused. It's going to be misinterpreted. I don't think it's a tragedy. It's not a big deal. Of course, it's going to happen. But I think it's good to always remember, it's just a tool. It's just a helpful way to understand different experiences. And I do feel like, in a way, some of the younger generation some of them are struggling with it, right? Some people I see are anxious about not feeling that they're following the rule that they've been taught that they should do, But more our people are saying, maybe the rule is a little bit too black and white, and maybe we need to be more subtle and be okay with that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one thing that I always think about is and this happens in politics a lot, where it's, my team versus your team. And then I think, if you want to look at it like that, I try to have episodes and content and material that, someone without a disability could watch and find entertaining, and, likewise for someone who has a disability. And I'm actively trying to bridge that gap. Whereas, I grew up in the South, North Carolina, and I just know, people have a set way of thinking, and it's very hard to change that. And that goes for both sides, it goes for both sides of any argument. But I think when you have such a definitive way, like you're describing, when you have a very black and white way of looking at things. If you're in the gray area, it may push you away from either or side, or even further from the other side that you want to be a part of, or felt that you were a part of, but then you felt like for example, me, I have this podcast, but I'm not a huge, I'll be honest, I'm not a huge, on the activist front, because one, I don't really know what I do. That's one thing, just kind of lack of direction there. But also, that's just not really me. Yeah. And maybe that's coming from my maybe that's correlated to my upbringing, my privilege that we talked about. But it's I'm more, let's have a conversation, let's learn and figure it out that way versus I've always been very against telling people to think a certain way, because I'll be honest, I don't like being told how to think. I like to be able to think for myself. Yeah. And if someone tells me how to think or do something, I typically, my personality type is, I tend to, go the other way. Yeah. And I think a lot of that's happening right now with politics and society. And I think there's even some clashes between minority groups in the disability community. Some people, want to be, if you're not actively vocal against ableism, then you're a part of the problem. And, while I don't think it's that black and white, I think there's a lot of gray area and so I don't know.
And I feel like one way to deal with that, and because I deal with it too. I mean, we're on the continuum here, and I might be more activist than you, and more even strict or doctrinaire or whatever that you are, but also less so than some folks on Twitter or some people who are more professional activists or whatever. Yeah. We're all somewhere in there. But I feel like one way to deal with that is and it's hard not to be, it's hard because you don't want to be patronizing, but at the same time you can say, look, what they are doing maybe has value. It may not be for me. It may not be my mode or my style, but perhaps what they're doing has value. It contributes something. Rather than saying, well, you're being too militant or too doctrinaire or whatever, it's a voice. It's somebody presenting a pole to look at and pull people in that direction. Well, other things are pulling people in another direction. I don't know. I know what you're saying. It's tough, and also just the general heightened tension can drive people away. Say, I just don't want to deal with that. One way I think this manifests with the disability community is I think that I've started to feel like that there are three distinct parts of the disability community. If you take the disability community to be everybody with any kind of physical or mental disability, you could divide it up in a lot of different ways. But one way that I think of it often and come back to is you've got disability activism, where you're dealing with legislation and goals of policy and practice, whether on a governmental level or even down at the community and workplace level. It's still kind of active, and you're trying to change laws, policy, and practices. And then you've got what I would call disability culture. And this is the people who are kind of doing, I think, what you're doing, which is let's talk about what the experience of disability is. And it can include some of the medical stuff, but also the social. How do we, what's our relationship with our disabilities? How do we feel others treat us? And it includes disability expressions of art, people who do poetry, people who do music, people who do visual art, people who do podcasts, write books, do articles. That's disability culture. And there's a lot of crossover with activism, but it's not quite the same. There are definitely people out there who, at first blush, you would say, well, they're activists, but they don't actually try to follow legislation that much or policy change much. What they're really talking about is how society views disability and how they view disability. And then there's a third group that I think of as like everybody else. That's people who have disabilities, aren't really into activism, don't think about disability that much in and of itself, and are just like trying to live with disabilities.
Yeah.
And the thing that I always want to know is, for number one, does that even make sense to think of it in those three different groups? And then how many people are in those groups? Because, again, that's getting back to the question of whether people who write about disability or whatever, whether we can speak for the disability community, well, are we 5% of the disability community or 30% or 50%? Right? Are all the people that write all the articles and do all the legislative work and do the books and the podcasts and discussions, do all of us amount to a tiny, tiny, tiny number of all the disabled people in America or in the world? Or do we actually add up to a lot if we put it all together? I just don't know. And that's one of the things I'm always really curious about.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And I would consider my mom part of that third group. Like, she's legally blind, but, I recently introduced her into some Facebook groups that involve RP, and she's kind of gotten into that. But she just worked and lived her life, and, and I have a hunch, and I'm curious to know what your hunch is. I have a feeling that there's more people in that third group than the other two groups.
That's my hunch for sure.
Yeah.
Now, I will say that I think that there's a lot of those folks who do activism sometimes, right?
Yes.
Who, if let's say somebody who's blind or legally blind, that if push comes to shove, and they are clearly denied a job, for instance, in a really unfair way based on their disability, they might get mad about it, and they might do something about it or try to do something about it.
Sure.
If a piece of
if it directly impacts them, is what you're saying.
and that sounds selfish, and sometimes it starts that way, and they might even expand it a little bit and say, you know what, I've had a couple of experiences, and I noticed this piece of legislation out there that would say require alternative format government materials, or that my college would do a better job of, accommodating people with visual impairments or something, and they would take that up as an issue, who are sort of somewhere between. So there's people on all those different sides, and there are people who will write about their personal experiences on disability or share them with local news and stuff like that, who could be viewed as part of disability culture. So, again, it's all blurry, but
yes,
and which is fine.
I think what's fascinating about that is, breaking it down to your three groups is, you mentioned it. Is it just 5% that are really into the broadcasting of acceptance of, the podcast or, the activist, and then those people are such a small percent, possibly might be such a small percentage of the community, yet those people feel as if they're talking for the entire community. And then those people in that third group we're talking about who just are living with their disability, maybe they don't want those people to even talk for them. You know what I mean?
And I think that's a legitimate question, and to be humble, we have to keep all that in mind. At the same time, even if it is only 5% or less, it's the 5% that got the ADA pass, that got almost everything that is there to accommodate in society disability has come from that little sliver. So, you know what I'm saying? Like, even if that's true,
I know what you mean.
Then we still have to think about the fact that maybe even that's okay. And again, those of us who are part of that, if we are, should maybe be humble and constantly remember that we don't speak for everybody. And most of the activists that I know do not claim to do that. It's more of something that's lobbed at them from people who have some other reason to not like what they're doing. But it's still something to be aware of. But again, even if it is just a tiny group, and maybe it's not that unusual that usually it's a relatively small number of people who do make the most change that benefits the others. And maybe that's okay.
That's a great point.
And maybe that's okay to an extent. We'd always like to have more allies and more people on board, but maybe that's just the way things happen. I don't know. Still learning all this stuff.
No, that's a great point. Sometimes it takes, a really, that 5%, they will get things done, and sometimes, you may, let's just say you may find that 5% annoying, but you may benefit from their activism, from their approaches. And that's, again, from that other standpoint, you have to accept that. In the same way you talked about being humble, on the other side, you have to also admit that, hey, they're helping me, they're helping the society as a whole. What they're wanting and requesting is a good thing. Yeah. And, personalities aside or viewpoints aside. So, that's great. That's a new way of, my new way of thinking about it. I'm going to steal your 3 model thing.
Well, again, there's also a dozen other ways you can divide up. And some people don't even like dividing up. They see that as divisive, oddly enough.
Yeah.
But for me, it's useful. I remember a biology teacher I had in high school who always used to make the joke. He said, the world is divided into 2 groups, people who like to divide the world into groups and those who don't. And I am a person who likes to divide people, not to separate them and like make them fight each other, but to understand them better. So, and I'm aware.
I'm the same way.
I'm aware that that's not everybody's cup of tea. And that's why you have people who don't, partly why you have people who don't want to say, I'm disabled or have a disability, because they want to emphasize, well, I'm a person, and my disability, having disability is not important. And I get that too. There's so many differences. It's hard to sort them through.
I know exactly what you mean. It's impossible to know what's on everyone's mind. And some people pretend they do. I don't know. I want to ask you something, because it's never been talked about on this podcast, and it's something I don't know anything about, and I'm openly admitting that. Okay. When it comes to you, and you talked about it a little bit at the beginning. So when it comes to like political platforms that benefit the disability community, what are the differences between the Democratic and Republican parties?
Oh, well, I mean, it's impossible for me anyway, and I think most people, to speak objectively about that. You know, I'm a Democrat. I'm a liberal, left liberal, kind of progressive.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I'm biased, of course. But I mean, I think. I mean, one of the keys into this is to look at the issue of fiscal policy, and it's kind of really boring, but you know, generally speaking, in the modern era, you know, the conservative Republican side has generally been for fiscal restraint, at least in the social policy area, and Democrats have been more apt to want to spend money on social programs. So, I mean, to be utterly simplistic, let's start there and say who is more likely to approve a more generous social safety net, health insurance coverage, give more flexibility and more support to people with disabilities, just in general. And I think, whereas now on the flip side of that, you know, the conservative Republican sort of side of things philosophically has a little bit more to say on this subject of individuality, of individual freedom, and a particular, not exclusive, but a particularly interesting viewpoint, alliances on issues like sort of right to life type of issues around things like assisted suicide, prenatal testing, and sort of existential things that at least some of the disability community are ambivalent about or feel very strongly about, where people on the left might be more on the side of things like legalizing assisted suicide. It's complicated. It's important to note, and people have been noting it lately a lot more, that a couple of decades ago, disability issues were a lot more bipartisan than they are now. They were never completely so. Again, that spending issue, I think, is sort of the core difference. And it's hard for a right-wing person to be really supportive of disability as a political matter, just by nature. You can be completely, you know, on at least on the you know, accepting that we're good people, individual, you know, helping us achieve individually, but it's hard to be supportive on a policy way if you're generally fiscally conservative and skeptical of social civil rights laws as a way to deal with stuff. It's harder to get through that to your own ideology. But again, despite that, one of the reasons why the ADA passed in 1990 was because it had significant bipartisan support. You had senators like Bob Dole, who was a Republican, pretty conservative, maybe not by today's standards, but still. But he had a disability, and he fought hard to get it passed, and others the same. It was signed by President the first George Bush, proudly. He didn't sign it in a closet, secretly embarrassed. He signed it with great pride. So yeah, I don't know if that's a coherent answer, but again, I think my view again is there are some built-in barriers and pathways where it's hard to maintain a certain ideology, broad ideology, and how it interacts with disability is tricky. But it can be tricky for both sides.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's a great answer, and it makes total sense. I guess I will add one more question to that. Do you think that either party has it figured out in terms of I guess, extending or giving the disability community what they need what's on the disability community's agenda in terms of activism and accessibility? Do you think either party is going to grant that It sounds like you said the Democratic Party is going to be more friendly in terms of money, financial assistance.
Okay, I'll put.
But are they thinking about things in an accessibility way? Is that actually a tenet on their agenda? You know,
it's so hard to talk about. I mean, again, I'm a Democrat, but I also feel like I guess what I feel like today changes all the time.
Yeah.
Right? Is that the Democratic / left framework has more of a built-in structure that can accommodate what the disability community needs more easily than what the Republicans and the right has. However, in practice, Democrats still don't really understand overall as much as they should, and and they don't prioritize these things to the degree that I would like to see.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to ask. Is it a priority for either party?
Not enough. Again, it's built into their framework. It should be a not a heavy lift, whereas it's a much heavier lift ideologically for a Republican, your average Republican, your average right winger, to deal with disability issues than it is for a Democrat. But that doesn't mean the Democrats do it on a regular basis. Some do. More do now than I think maybe a little while ago. The 2020 presidential race did produce one notable thing where a bunch of candidates for president put out really detailed policy platforms, which by itself is a difference. Like, there's been some candidates in the recent years who did, but it was kind of spotty and maybe just, not a bunch of them, but a bunch ended up doing it. Again, how they're following through is an entirely different thing. A lot of the disability activist community is having a real hard time with the CDC right now and how it's talking about disability and chronic illness in terms of the pandemic, and how their policies seem to be going that in ways that may not be that good for us. And this is in a Democratic administration. And there are definitely disability activists who voted for Biden probably and worked to try and, get that through, who are really questioning whether it was worth it. And, so yeah, it's messy. It's messy. It's not an obvious thing. Yeah. And I do believe, I can't quite, I think it's Pew did some research back in 2016. I don't know if there's been any more recent research, but in 2016, they did some polling and found that basically that among people with disabilities who are eligible voters, that basically it was evenly split between Democrats and Republicans. It wasn't like I think my recollection is it went a little bit slightly toward Hillary Clinton rather than Donald Trump, but not like by any huge, super noticeable, clearly disabled people prefer blah, like that. It wasn't.
Yeah.
So
that's a good point, because I often wonder about that. I wonder percentage wise of the disability community, who's Democrat or Republican. And that's kind of, again, the theme here tonight on this interview here is there's so many different viewpoints, and it's hard to talk for everyone. Well,
incidentally, that brings up if anybody wants a very specific issue to pursue that isn't super partisan and is just might be a good thing. It could. Here's one, which is to get presidential and other political polling, regularly ask about disability. so that they can, so that all of the polls on issues and candidates in every race, in addition to showing, how people were by race, ethnicity, age, employment status, all that, income, which is all standard. There should be disability as well. And in order for that to happen, it has to be more than just one polling agency that does a special project. It has to be a regular thing. So there's an advocacy issue that anybody could sink their teeth into and try to get people to change that. Yeah,
I'd be curious to know the data on that. And you're right. Someone has to make that happen.
You have to collect the data in order to read it,
Exactly,
and traditionally they haven't collected it as much. There are some folks at Rutgers University, Lisa Scher and Douglas Cruz, who have been doing research for quite a while now on voter participation, which is really good to look up.
Yeah.
They spend a little less time, I think, on like how people voted, but more on their participation, what the gaps are and what the reasons for those gaps, and stuff like that. But again, that's super useful as well.
Amazing. Yeah, I have to look into that, and that's something I'll maybe I can provide some links in the show description if you're listening and you're interested in wanting to learn more about that.
Yeah.
I can also I'll add a link to some articles that you've written. You also have it's called Cryptovote, right? Website.
Yeah, myself and two other activists, Alice Wong and Greg Baratan, have been doing this since 2016. It's a Twitter hashtag. So it's mostly a Twitter thing where we're just trying to use the hashtag to tie together discussions about disability issues and voting, voter participation, especially.
Which is what we just talked about. Yeah.
So again, they're cool.
I'll have to click on that hashtag.
Exactly. That's just, you click on it and look and see what people are saying on any given day. It's just an ongoing conversation.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, we talked for, over an hour now. So I know you're busy, but I really do value your time, and I really enjoyed this conversation. And if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to check out the articles in the show description of Andrew's writing. I'll have a link to those articles. Check out Cryptovote on Twitter. Is there anything else you want to plug about yourself?
Well, I would want to plug other writers too and other stuff. I think Twitter's a decent place to start. It's not the world, but it's a good place to go to find other people talking about this stuff from similar or maybe different perspectives. I definitely encourage people, if they have if they can, to go out and do that and to explore. Maybe that hashtags is a good way to start. Cryptovote. Another was no body is disposable around the pandemic, and high risk of COVID-19 is another hashtag. There's hashtags like, just disability Twitter has been used as a very general one to help pull that together, and a bunch of others, and other people who are really great on Twitter and some that are on Facebook, that I think it's good to follow and just see what they're saying from day to day. There are a lot of people out there, a lot of organizations doing interesting work. They're not hard to find, but if you're not looking for them, it's so easy to get the sense that nobody's doing anything, that nothing's happening, that it's an empty space, and it's really not, especially since the rise of social media. So, go out and explore. There's a lot to find.
All right. Well, everyone, you just heard Andrew to go out and explore. I'm going to go out and explore. Again, thanks for your time, and I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, Lance. It's been a pleasure.